Some may know me from Transparency International or the Moscow High School of Economics. Today I am privileged to be a moderator of this panel. I'm happy to welcome you all here, and I'm happy and honored to be a moderator thanks to the Moscow School of Political Studies and Civic Education. And I shall be calling this school Moscow School of Political Studies, irrespective of the circumstances. So this will be the name. I congratulate Elena, Yuri, and all of us, indeed, with the 25th anniversary of the school. But a jubilee is not just about festivities, but also about some discussions. So this panel is quite a representative, and I have been asking myself, really, why is it that the civic society and the assemblies, we hardly have any people sitting in the first rows. Usually the first rows are empty, and the backbenches are a lot more isolated and more common in the civil society organizations and meetings. So this may be a part of the problems we're facing, which is that the civic activists are often viewing themselves as backbenchers. So today we decided to interpret this differently, and indeed sat in the first row, and this beautiful panel that we have here will try to consider the question as to what it is, what is the moment where we live, what is this crucial time, critical decisions, time for critical state. Yesterday we spoke about the crisis we are facing in Russia, in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere. And it was said by the speakers and those participants of the discussion that it could have been partially because of our drawback or indeed the poor judgment. Yesterday evening we had a dinner at the Faustus restaurant here in Berlin, and there was a line from Goethe's Faustus on the line which said that you can only go as far as you don't make a mistake. And then I came to my room and continued to read from that line in Faustus. And as you go, you have to allow yourself the right to make mistakes. Learning by doing. So learning by doing, in this sense, is an attempt to overcome this atmosphere of the doom and the gloom that we are seeing around us. People don't want to wake up in the mornings because everything is going to the dogs. And that being said, we have a different shade, and as they say, every cloud has a silver lining, and this is the silver lining we're seeing here in this audience. So let me just allow for this discussion to start as to what is the current situation, how have we come here, and then we can probably deliberate on some ways out. Because stating the fact of falling into the abyss is not sufficient to get out of the abyss. So let me give the floor to a friend, to a great friend who has indeed been traveling and not just riding the tanks in Russia and elsewhere, but has always been riding the metaphorical tanks, Pilar Bonet of El País in Russia. This will be a bilingual session. Thank you very much, Elena. before we start, it wasn't a tank really. It was an army reconnaissance vehicle that I was riding, which was after the South Ossetian War that I had to make a part of my way. And as I, on an individual level, I will be talking in the capacity of a private person rather than a correspondent of or the bureau chief of El País. And my viewpoint is I'm not trying to take myself too seriously. However, I'm trying to consider myself serious enough to say yes or no to some things. Because every one of us has the choice of saying yes or no. And I think that
because I wrote it in English, although my language is Spanish. Lena has asked us to define what is the message, and my message as a correspondent in Moscow will be: I am overwhelmed. I am completely overwhelmed. I am overwhelmed by the amount of information we have to deal with, by the mixture of propaganda and information in proportions which are not clearly defined, and in a way we cannot find out who has mixed them in what way. And that I am overwhelmed by the technical complexity of what we get in internet and our inability, in my case, as someone who comes from the humanitarian field, to find out what is true and what is not true. Propaganda has existed in the past too, yeah? But in the past, during the Soviet times, we used to look for the Adnako, and we knew what was true and what was propaganda. Now there is not any Adnako, and we are told there is the hand of the Kremlin. And my question would be, how many hands has the Kremlin? 1 hand? 2 hands? Or maybe 40 hands, like in Russia, you have this little insect, which is called Sarakanoshna. I don't know what it is called in English. I think it's centipede, yeah, or something like this. In Spain, it's 100 feet. So if we have 100 hands, we have to be precise. What hand are we talking about? And not only I am overwhelmed by the 1 hand of the 100 hands, but I am also overwhelmed by the reaction in the West, by the one paranoia and the other paranoia. By I wonder who are the institutions and the bodies who interpret how many hands has the Kremlin. How do they see that there is the Kremlin, or is Russia, or is the post-Soviet space? I don't know. I don't have the technical tools which will enable me to fulfill, to understand what I see, and to fulfill what I think is the mission of a journalist. I might be very idealistic, but I still think that journalists has 2 main missions, which are to be a public service and to convey information and describe facts for other people to interpret, and to give them freedom to interpret them. And I see that journalism today is caught in a war. And from trench to trench, trying to find what is happening in one trench and to find out what is happening in the other trench, and trying to avoid being fired in the process. And no matter whether the trench are digged in the mud or whether the trench are in the cyberspace, they are still trenches. So one important thing is to restore journalism as a special space, the space of truth and the space of service, and to take it away from the battlefield, which doesn't mean journalism has not its own battles, but it's not the general battle between one side or the other. We are now in the case of the journalists from Western countries working in Moscow. I think that from the last time we were here, that was in October last year, the situation has deteriorated. because we were here before the American elections. So after that, we have all these informations about Russia interfering in Washington, and also, in my case, the informations or disinformations about Russia interfering in Catalonia, which for me has been a nightmare because it has transformed what was part of the work in part of my life. And this is a very interesting subject for me because I have seen the conflicts in the post-Soviet space projected on the problem of Catalonia. Not that those who were looking at Catalonia were studying what comes from Catalonia, that reality, but they were projecting things on it, and I thought it was fascinating. But at the same time, it showed how fragile we are and how spaces are interconnected. It has deteriorated also because we have in Russia new pieces of legislation which can make our life harder, as for instance these amendments to the law which can transform us in foreign agents. I mean, because the subject of foreign agent is not clearly defined, so it can be any foreign paper, it can be any foreign correspondent, or anybody who gets money from abroad. And also we have legislation, I saw in the press 2 days ago, which will enable companies not to disclose economic information, and which I think it's a prevention for news sanctions. We have a degradation of our profession in the way it is understood. As an example, in Russia we have 2 prankers, I think is the name called, who get information from political personalities in the West mainly by deceiving them, by fake identities. And Maria Zakharova, for instance, who is the Speaker of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, praised them as fighters in the front of information. I wrote about that because I thought it is a very worrying subject that official representative thinks that information is about war, and is it about deceiving, that the deceiving can be used in this job. And I didn't get much of understanding. Most people in my own country who reacted, if the reactions were true, were saying it's okay that these guys have deceived our Minister of Defense because she deserves it. And that was one reaction, and the other were just laughed. They didn't realize that it was soft power, yeah? And a kind of soft power in which you make the others laughable, and that way you ridiculize them. And I think this is very worrying because the contour of our profession, what should be in the code of ethic code of this profession is not clear enough and is being deformed, and people accept that. And that it's already over.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the last...
Last 20.
Yeah. And the last. I always thought I have a last resource, which was the question. I always thought I cannot get the answer, but at least I will ask the question. And for years I was a philosophical developer of the art of the question. But now, not even the question, yeah? Because, for instance, if, you cannot ask any question to Putin unless you show a red hat or something very, very bright or a big notice or something like this. And for 3 years, I've been going to press conferences, for 4 years, to press conference of Putin with the same question, which is lying on my table and which I take with me, hoping that one day I will be able to ask it. But I didn't get this up to now, and I wonder whether it will be possible in the future. Thank you very much.
What is the question?
The question, no, I won't tell you the question because...
Right, otherwise...
Because the question is being developed. Each year I add something to that question. So the question is already so organized that it's impossible not to. What do you say? It cannot be impermeable. You can. It's.
Waterproof, yeah. Спасибо большое, Пилар. Ира, Пилар сказала, что
Irina, Pilar has said that the new technologies, modern technologies, have broken into the life of the journalists. Prankers call themselves journalists. The representative of the Russian Foreign Office is saying that these are fighters on the information front, new media, social networks, freedom for and struggle for freedom of expression, the engulfing of the intellectual discussion by the very whimsical things. What is happening really, Irina? Irina Borogan is a journalist, author of books, and founder of Agentura.ru. I am a journalist, a writer. We are seeing things which are not particularly nice. We are generally used to think, we used to think that internet was created as a free platform, and there was an advantage in the internet that the exchange of information was unbiased, free, and not recognizing constraints. But because of the events of the past years, such as the hackers' attack against the US-based servers, as well as the servers in Europe, a big political scandal ensued. What did it entail? Up until then, there was no concept of information security from the standpoint of the internet. At least there was the term of cybersecurity. And when you were at a Western conference and when you were meeting Western journalists, everybody said that you have to be guarding your service from hackers' attacks, or at least from those who could sell your information or indeed some the attacks from the service which could put under danger big objects of infrastructure. The Russians and the Chinese, conversely, have been using the term of information security to the effect that the free dissemination of information could be of danger. And up to the point when in the Russian concept of information security it was said that information, free exchange of information, may cause psychological harm to the people of Russia, harm to the children, and so on and so forth, which are very hard to define. So all in all, this was being reduced to the precept of controlling the flow of information. It was more or less understood that Russia was the land of censorship and the West was generally the land of information freedom. However, in the past times, because of the hackers' attacks, this started to evolve and change in the West, and up to the point when the deliberation about the information security has also started in the West, which is a bad sign. This is also something that we start hearing in the Ukraine. We could hardly expect from a new democratic government of the Ukraine, however, because of the story and the joining of Crimea to Russia, as well as the story of the war in the east of the Ukraine. We have seen that the Ukrainian government started to speak about the information aggression from Russia, and then they banned the Vkontakte social network because it was emanating from Russia, which was indeed a mirror image of what the Russian security forces have been speaking about up till now, up until the banning of Facebook and Google, according to the Chinese scenario. This has led to a situation whereby we still believe that that Americans are the pioneers, and the Americans, because of this political pressure of the Russian theme, they have also started using the term of information security. Up until and even the hearings which take place in the Congress related to Google and Facebook are changing this free flow of information rhetoric towards some sort of regulation. Of course, there's no word about state-imposed control, but there is a little bit of a swinging of the pendulum towards control and supervision. Well, I certainly do not decry the situation when on the one hand there are the users like you and me, and on the other hand it's the trolls, the bots and the propaganda machines. But the fact that there is this rhetoric about control in the West is not particularly encouraging. Sylvie, if I may ask a question, you have a very Sylvie Kauffmann from Le Monde with the extremely rich experience of observing Russia and providing analysis. How do you see the situation of today? What are the forebodings and what do you expect?
Situation is bad, but it's not hopeless. That's the message. How did we get there? I want to talk about a picture that I have on my desk, and I've had it for many, many years, and it has nothing to do with this part of the world. It was taken in New Caledonia, which is a small island in the middle of the South Pacific. It happens to be French. It was colonized by the French. And this picture is, I was sent there because there was a rebellion of the natives in the 1980s. And I was sent there as a very young reporter. And I met this bright leader of the liberation movement of the Kanaks. That's the name of those, of the ethnic of the natives. And he was a fascinating person. He was extremely articulate and moderate. He wanted to negotiate with the French government, which he did. And so one day we were talking together on the field. I was actually interviewing him. Somebody took this picture, and you know, it's a great picture. A couple of years later, he was killed, not by the French gendarmerie, but by the radicals, some people of the radical wing of his movement who didn't like his stand about negotiation. But he's dead, but his ideas have prevailed. He was fighting for freedom and for his rights, and over the years there have been many negotiations, there have been referendums, so it's still a French territory, but the relationship is much looser, and they have much more autonomy, and I think he would be quite happy with the situation today. Now, from New Caledonia, I went to Moscow and Poland, and there it's a very different landscape, no more palm trees, but I found the same obsession among some people, quite a number of people, freedom and rights. And I witnessed some, history in the making from 1986 to 1993. I will never forget the day I was on the platform of, I think it was Kazansky Vokzal, where Andrey Sakharov came back from Gorky, and he opened the door of the train, and what did he say? We were a few Western correspondents there and a lot of KGB people, and he said, "I will go on." His first words with Elena Bonet was, "I will fight on." And a couple of years later, I was in Poland, and earlier, and when those prisoners from Solidarność were released from jail, Andrei Sakharov, 1986, yeah, December, yeah, and okay, and so it was the same. These guys were released from prison, Adam Michnik, Jacek Kuroń, and it was the same, we will fight on, and they did. Now, when they eventually won, we thought it was forever. They thought it was forever, that this battle was won, and, historical mistakes were corrected, communism was defeated, and that was it. So it turns out it was not forever. But I think the problem is much more complicated than we think. It's not, we're not going backward. Maybe it's even worse because these ideas that all these brave and bright people fought for are being attacked from within. So within, that means the National Front in France, AfD here, UKIP, Donald Trump, but also Orban, Kaczynski. So we have this very powerful movement. That's the crisis. Now, what's happening also is that my friends, our friends, these people who were fighting, who were in the streets 30 years ago, they're back in the streets in Poland. They're fighting again. And what are they fighting for? The same ideas. Gazeta Wyborcza, this paper which was founded in 1989, is again a combat newspaper. Like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they are combat newspapers today. So there's a struggle, it's a fight. It's a tough struggle, but what strikes me is that none of these people, National Front, AfD, Trump, have come up with a better idea. I don't see an alternative. Maybe the alternative some people are trying is the Chinese or the Singapore model. Yeah, I'm watching this. I've been watching this because I also worked in Asia, and I've been watching this for the past 10, 15 years with a lot of attention because, they're making a little bit of progress. But I think this is Asia. This is different. I think in Europe, we haven't come up. Nobody's come up with a better idea than these guys fought for. So maybe the message is we have to keep fighting, and maybe we have to adjust our fighting. Maybe we have to do it a little bit differently because the situation is different. But the ideas we have defended are still the ones. There are no better ones around.
Спасибо большое, Сильви. И прежде чем...
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And before I ask a question to those who are economists and practitioners, and maybe they will give us an explanation, maybe behind all that there is some economic or practical or real down-to-earth reason for changing this landscape where we live in, because this crisis gets more and more grave. I would like to ask John, who has great experience of analyzing the economic component and political component in all the events. Are we really going backwards, or is it moving ahead, looking ahead for some new reality to be born, which really grows up from within us and which is fighting us, trying, as Sylvie put it, making us fight?
Thank you, Elena. About a little over 10 years ago, I, with others, founded the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which is in Oxford. And the idea was to try to understand what we were doing, what we journalists were doing, how we were doing it, and perhaps in some ways most importantly what effect it was having on the people we were saying we were doing it for, which was the people. We've been going 11 years, we haven't yet found out what we were doing and why. It's a long business finding out what we're doing, because in some ways journalism has always been, and certainly now is, it has always been its own public relations. It always says, we say, journalists say, we are holding power to account. Pilar with her waterproof question was going to hold, if she could ever get it asked, was going to hold Putin to account. But do we really hold power to account? Not just in authoritarian countries, but... So the question is, are the basics of journalism actually being followed? Journalism is a trade in the world which varies hugely. It varies from a devotion to finding and discovering the truth, a real devotion through investigative journalism, through endless questions, through reading, through discovering trails, through what is in some ways more common, a determination of the people who own the means of journalism to make as much money as possible from it by publishing gossip, conflict, polemics, and so on, and many are successful, through to and we've been talking about that already yesterday, to submission to authoritarian control. And Elena, when she asked me to do this, said, talk a little bit about fake news. Fake news, which is now everywhere, it's said to be everywhere, in authoritarian societies, fake news and propaganda is most of the content. Irina was referring to that earlier, and always has been. In the intense periods of Stalinism and Maoism, journalism was entirely a slave. What journalists wrote was dictated to them, sometimes literally, by the regime, and they had to write it, even if writing it or broadcasting it was the opposite of what had been said the day before, because the regime had changed its mind. And that was, of course, dramatized by George Orwell in 1984. The hero of 1984 is a journalist, Winston Smith, whose job is to falsify the past in order to justify the present. Authoritarian journalists, or journalists in authoritarian and despotic states, cannot know what the truth is because they aren't allowed to discover it. They write or broadcast what the regime tells them. But in softer authoritarianism, and we heard a lot about that yesterday in a number of the seminars, it's different. It's more the norm now in a soft authoritarianism. There is space to tell some truths, aided by the net and social media, which are very difficult to suppress, although the Chinese are trying hard to do so, with hundreds of thousands of people working on suppressing tweets and messages which they don't like. Some of the people who are here, who are on this panel, and who are here at this 25th anniversary of the school, are close to the school, and they're examples of people who are working, who are able to work in the soft authoritarianism, which is Russia today. Andrey Soldatov, Irina Borogan, Maxim Trudolyubov, Mikhail Fishman, who were part of that extraordinary, interesting seminar yesterday, and others. They use critical analysis, investigative reporting to try to tell some of the truth and to try to hold power to account. So the state of Russian society is that some space remains in order to try to discover the truth, to give some critical analysis, although it's swamped continually by state-sponsored media and therefore has to poke out here and there when it can, or is confined to one stratum of society, perhaps one could say to the liberal stratum by and large. And in democratic countries, the variation is at least as great as in authoritarian countries. There's a lot of fake news, or partly true, partly fake news, often in tabloid journalism, both written and broadcast. Journalism is a trade, it's not a profession. So, and it's a trade because it's open to everybody. And it's open to everybody because it says, and this is true, that it should be free. It is free speech. And if you're having free speech, then it's got to be open to everyone, and it's more open to everyone now in the age of the net and the social media, so there's no boundaries. It's not like professions like the law and medicine and the academy and the science-based professions, where you have to be trained. I mean, you wouldn't make flying an aircraft free to everybody. You have to be trained. In journalism, you don't. And that means both that it can be free and that it can be awful. And of course, it's very often both free and awful. So far, at least, we put up with the awful. The thing I want to end with is to say that the awfulness has come home to roost in the last year or so. And the awfulness is, this is not anti-American propaganda, the awfulness is Donald Trump. That the country which most of us, and many in Russia especially, looked to America as the place where journalism was free, the freedom was protected, and the freedom gave rise to some tremendous journalism and still does, is headed by a man who does not believe that, who believes that journalism should conform to what he says is the truth, which is often a lie. Yesterday, day before Thanksgiving, his press people in the White House put out that he was going to Mar-a-Lago in Florida in order to do some more work. He was going to work all day, he was going to meet people, he was going to phone people, he was going to read papers, which would be the first time probably he'd ever read a paper, a briefing paper, and that would be, you know. So the journalist went down to follow him, and hey presto, at 9 o'clock, he gets in his car and goes to the golf course. And the press office is still putting out that he's going to work all day in his office. And that kind of, it's minor in a way, but it's also major. It encapsulates what the Trump presidency is about. It's going into authoritarian journalism. It's saying, don't report what you see and what you understand and what you know to be the truth. This is the truth. My truth is the truth. And the rest is, guess what, is fake news. And that, I think, that's our real battle in democratic countries, but also in authoritarian countries. We have, for the first time in America, the first time ever, someone whose main focus is the media. What does he do? He doesn't really govern, he tweets, he has battles with people about the media. He says that he's glad that somebody's been fired from CNN. Or, in other words, he doesn't concern himself much about what a US president conventionally has done. He's in the media and he wants to destroy it. And that, I think, is, and he's getting support. He can get support from authoritarians like Erdogan in Turkey and al-Sisi in Egypt, and indeed from President Putin, all of whom he admires. So we have a paradoxical situation that the West now, the summit of journalism in the West, which has been so for decades, if not centuries, is now battling with the whole idea and practice of a free press.
Well, thank you very much, John. Indeed, the situation evolves in such a way that indeed there's fake news, there's tweets, presidential tweets, presidents, and it's hard to understand why they went in for presidency. But many people say that this news and this sort of journalism and presidents like this also is what people want now. That politicians and economy have changed in the new global world in such a way that it means it is a new free choice of people, and you are not, you highbrow, arrogant people, you don't dispute or don't challenge this choice by the people. I want to ask Mr. Fredrik, the Director of International Center for Political Studies, from your perspective, what they have been trying to say that this is the reason for the changing landscape. Question is for Fredrik Erixon. This landscape of values, landscape of media, landscape of journalism, is it grounded on people's changing looks and what the economy is and politics? And what is the situation like? Where are we nowadays? Please.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the kind invitation, Lena and Yuri and others, to come and join you here for the 25th anniversary, and indeed, happy anniversary.
Happy New Year.
And I hope I'm still going to be around to be here for the 50th anniversary, 25 years from now. Let me sort of follow on where John ended, and I think sort of the question we need to ask ourselves is sort of why is there a demand for not just fake news, but for a type of fantasy politics, as the science fiction writer Kurt Anderson called it in a very good essay in the New Atlantic a few weeks ago, that people respond positively to politicians and others that want to project an image about themselves, about the society they live in, about the economy, which is fundamentally unrepresentative of the reality itself. My point is that I don't think this is anything new. I don't think the problem is that Trump emerged or that other sort of semi-authoritarian populist demagogues occurred and responded to sort of a depressed demand that existed. I think we've seen a gradual movement in this direction for a long time. And for me, it basically goes back to more fundamental questions about psychology, about political psychology, and about the development in the Western world that we've been seeing evolving for at least 40, 50 years. I think it goes back to, sort of if we use psychological terms, a gradual development where personal responsibility has become a devalued human character or a human asset, and where we have gradually started to anonymize people in societies, and especially anonymize individuals and the completeness of individuals. If we look at, start sort of in the field of economics and trying to see what happens there, and there are of course a lot of people now that want to see a direct linkage between growing income inequality, stagnating wages, and the rise of these authoritarian or semi-authoritarian populists in the West, that the political revolts, Brexit, Trump, or whatever revolt we want to look at, that it's fundamentally a consequence about an economy which gradually has become less responsive to the white working class or people that traditionally had fared pretty well in the economy, but they haven't recently. I think there's probably some truth in that view, but I wouldn't, even as a paid-up member of the economist tribe, I wouldn't put that much emphasis on it. I think there is an economic explanation, but it has much more sort of fundamentally to do with the anonymization of the individual in the economy, that when you look at workplaces today, it's very difficult to detect your individual contribution to what is being produced at this particular workplace. We are creating teams in large organizations that are becoming frightfully bureaucratic, almost Kafkaesque in their operation. And people are unhappy, people are unsatisfied with a general type of organizational development which is very bad at trying to give people what is the true essence of integrity, which is that you're whole as an individual and you have a right to be described in your wholeness to other people. We see broadly in the abstract an economy which is moving along the trends of specialization, with human capital becomes more specialized, companies, organizations become much more specialized, but that it sort of in essence means that you sort of minimizing your own individual contribution to something to such a degree that often you can't see sort of what the end product is going to be like or what your contribution has been. We have a capitalist system which has been sort of silently taken over by financial institutions. We don't know anymore who owns a company and who's responsible for a company. We know that you have sort of sovereign wealth funds, you have BlackRock, you have Vanguard, you have all the big banks that are there and owning things, but they don't seem to have responsibilities over things. My point, however, is that if we move away from the economics and go into politics, I think we are going to find a far more interesting story about this new demand for fantasy politics, or not new demand, but demand for fantasy politics. And I think it goes back to a particular period in Western history, mostly articulated in the American debate, but also in the European debate. Something that happened in the 1960s, late 1960s, when you had that merger between young Marxian thinking, Freudian introspection, and what the American essayist Tom Wolfe called the Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening in the United States. And the Third Great Awakening was, of course, the rise of political evangelism and how that evangelism, despite its professed cause of being a counter-revolution against the Marxists and against the leftist turn, or the left liberal turn they had in America in the 1960s at the universities. It was broadly an evangelism that thrived on the same type of psychological traits and psychological characteristics as other salvationist ideologies at that time, Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. This was basically a philosophy in the evangelism which was highly me-centric. It created a type of narcissism that united both the left and the right, which I think we previously hadn't seen in history, and we haven't seen among younger generations either. It was, as Tom Wolfe called it, a me decade, and he wrote that in the 1970s, and of course in later decades we saw that sort of narcissism to become even more articulated. Now, what is it that makes this sort of these three salvationist ideologies so unique? Well, in its essence, it's about the notion that you cannot be responsible for your own consciousness, that you are entitled to, sort of in Freudian psychoanalysis, to use the methods of free association, but you can never get back and be control of your own consciousness. And that led to philosophies around that went very much against the idea of reason, the role of reason in society, the role of reason in trying to progress politics in a good way. The personal became political. That was the title of a 1969 essay, a very good essay by American feminists. And ever since then, we have seen sort of that in the absence of being responsible for your own consciousness, you basically go to physical attributes, perhaps your gender, your skin color, or other attributes in order to define who you are and what my aspirations for politics is going to be. And if the personal is political, how on earth are you going to compromise with other people that don't have the same personal traits as you? You can't compromise about yourself. And gradually we saw that sort of appetite for sort of me, and my interests to be reflected in societies to become much, much stronger. And in sort of absence of that responsibility of your own consciousness, we developed that psychological demand for fake news, for fantasyland type of politics, where politicians could spurn out whatever type of view they had of society, regardless to what extent it corresponded with the actual reality, but people wanted to have it. So if we look to journalism, there are sort of a good number of high-quality newspapers in America and the rest of the world, but they have been in decline for a pretty long time, and they haven't been even remotely close to being as important in terms of participating or being the idiom of the discussion about our human personality as sort of the televangelists, all the sort of religious books, all the sort of this political evangelism that came out during the 70s, 80s, and 1990s in America. These books have always been sort of topping the New York Times bestseller lists. They have reached a far wider audience than any type of quality journalism has done. And we shouldn't be surprised that 87% of all evangelists in America voted for Donald Trump, because they have sort of gradually been sort of exposed to this type of fantasy land or fantasy politics, and gradually been building up the demand for a version of reality which is fundamentally untrue. So my conclusion then would be, and this is the silver lining, if I'm allowed to come to the silver lining already now, which is that personal responsibility, I think, is extraordinarily important in order to build societies where reason can flourish. I think it's extraordinarily rewarding, not necessarily rewarding in a monetary way, but I think it's mentally enormously rewarding to be and take personal responsibility. And I think in whatever type of society you live, you will always find that there's a lot of space for that type of individual personalities. And I think that's the good news. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fredrik. And probably at this time where you speak about the role of personal responsibility, personal conscience in this fantasy world, fantasy politics, fantasy policy, fantasy ideas about economy, fantasy ideas about the world around us. Probably this is the time to ask a question to Sergei Petrov, who worked for politics and economy and business, and now in this public and social activism, in his status, has been trying to show us this sort of public and political conscience. Where are we? Does this conscientious civics, does it work at all to survive in this fantasy world? I don't know who organized this, probably Irina. It's like what we discuss right now together with Genghis Khan and Sergei, some problems of European integration. We have such different problems. It's hard to me to focus, but I believe that far more important are our problems for our audience, because they are more dangerous. Because that the narcissism of Mr. Trump, or his attitude towards the media, or in absence of responsibility, it's Western society. It will take care of it. We know it. We know how these mechanisms work when it will reach some kind of critical level. In our situation, the situation is very much unlike, and it seems far more dangerous. I suppose Lev some 2 years ago made a survey. Some 57% of our population are ready to recognize official lies as televised by Russian TV channels if it serves the interests of the state. Well, we are at a stage when there are no mechanisms to correct our problems. Now that we have like nuclear weapons that is controlled God knows by whom. Nowadays we have more or less people who are normal, but tomorrow there may be totally people who cannot be considered responsible, and this may be quite pose far more greater danger than something far more unreasonable, rather than what John and other distinguished people mentioned. I understand that this is worrying them, but when with my background and experience since 9 years in the Russian parliament, I can see that there is nothing we can do. We're like hostages about this 57% audience mass. I call them social gravity. How does it work? I can give you a couple of examples. When you, for example, talk to your colleagues in the parliament with the ministers, you say, look, you can't do it this way, it won't do. You know, it's what do you do? But look here, this is the country we lived in. And everybody is like in a situation like, well, everybody wants to get some chunk of his own happiness. Why do I want to lose my interest, my share? I don't want to sacrifice my future and myself. For which purpose? Nothing much will change. Kudrin will say, well, what can I do? What can I do? Do you need another Kasyanov? Do you want me to wage a war? All the others are just very busy carrying guns and getting somebody's business to the... And there is no desire to quarrel with that mass. What is strong about them, that they can't hear of things other than what they want to hear. They influence in a very... It sort of is wrapping you, like swaddling you, and each of us had to think how much to step back to what mechanism to come up. Fake news, God forbid. We must need first convince them that opposition, they should like reference point. We need an opposition, we should say something, and that we don't want to be beaten by stones, we don't want to be stoned, because in a while without the opposition, well, you know, historic fact, we get into this historic impasse, and so far it is not, we are still retreating both in business and in politics.
In politics, there's probably one mechanism, which is hard to describe, but I'll quote an example. When I'm flying from Tokyo, I'm in a plane, and there's a top manager from one of the defense Russian plants, who has just concluded a very beneficial contract with Mitsubishi, or one of the Japanese corporations, and I talk business with him, and he's saying to him, and he tells me, we were able to conclude this contract because our army is now strong and powerful, and the Japanese concluded this contract. So we're trying to talk about something, but we are talking very different languages. You know, what time is it now? Thank you, I already have lunch. This is the kind of conversation we're having. And these are people who have great levers in that system. You might have heard that about 70% of the Russian economy is currently under the control of the state. The rest, 30%, are made up, partially made up, of the servicing organizations or servicing companies. And many of them are told, you've been able to make this money and now you're asking questions. It's simply, and a big part of the business are saying this, like, you've been able to make this money, you've been allowed to make this money. A manager from Lukoil, for instance, may be telling me, he's a Lukoil manager overseas somewhere in Dubai in an office, and he's telling me that after the war in Iraq, they were trying to, they got some lucrative contracts, the 41 tenders, and I said, were you bribing? No, the new Iraqi government conducted tenders and we got some contracts. And I said, how about the Americans? Well, the Americans didn't get anything really, just a couple of two poor fields, mostly the Chinese, the Italians, and then in 10 minutes he's telling me the Americans came to Iraq for the oil, and then I'm telling him, wait, you told me 10 minutes ago that the Americans didn't get much tenders out of the oil now. What we are saying is that this social gravity is a big factor of a big onus. It's not just about Mr. Putin or his team. It's a big pressure on negative pressure on the part of those who simply don't want to hear any other news. They're ready to listen to Solovyovs and the likes of Solovyovs and Kiselyovs. And unfortunately, there's a lot of hypocrisy in this. But rephrasing one great film directors, I can say that when the state is evolving, the elites establish the morals, and when the state is degrading, the elites are often following the lead of the base, of the degraded, of the cynical. And unfortunately, the country has all this horrible nuclear arsenal. In addition to the nuclear power plants, it's a powder box. And we understand that there has to be no civil war or no conflict that could in any way endanger this huge lethal potential that Russia has. And indeed, the question really is that destabilizing the country is a mortal danger. So this understanding does have roots in the Russian history, and there is so much allusions to 1917 that really led Russia to the demise. And I have to tell you that these are not primitive people. These are people who understand history in that way. On the other hand, they, as unfortunately, they depend on this electoral base. And if we were to ask the question, what would you choose between the anarchy or the order, then most people would say the order. But in the American audience, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that people would vote for anarchy rather than strict order, because they would think that they can manage themselves. Self-government in Russia is virtually ended. There is no self-government, and what we can, we're really where we are. So what we can do is try to understand and give ourselves the account where we are. So we can be there can be some debatable questions. We could discuss President Trump, but unfortunately we have too many concerns in Russia. Jesper Roine, professor of the Stockholm School of Economics, joining us here in Berlin.
Anarchy or stability in 2017, when we talk about fake news, when we talk about like everything changing, how we happen to be here from the point of view of normal development of events?
Okay, so that's a small question.
I know.
Let me start by saying that I may go off on some trajectory because I prepared a couple of points and then I'm listening to these interesting people and I realized that, you know, what I thought I would talk about is maybe not perfectly aligned with the points made here. So I'll just try to improvise a bit. So the reason I'm saying this is that first of all, I'm not a journalist, I'm a researcher, and in that capacity also a teacher at the Stockholm School of Economics. By training, I'm an economist, but otherwise I'm interested in just about every field out there. And I'll come back to that. I think that's a virtue of both myself and of this audience and the Moscow School and the way you work. If I start by saying a few things about, from my perspective, where I think we stand in terms of global development, and my perspective here is a historical one. I research long-run inequality development in particular, but also long-run economic and social development. So my perspective is more often more than a decade, more than 100 years. And in that perspective, the world has never been as good as it is today. So that's, the good part. We've never been as prosperous. We've never had such amazing abilities and technologies and cures for all sorts of terrible things. In a long-run perspective, just about every part of the world has become a better place on average. Now that last bit, on average, is important because this is not to be confused with, which I think sometimes is the case, this positive view of development is not to be confused with that everyone is in a better place now than they used to be. So this comes back to why I have an interest in distributional issues, because I think really our main challenge for the future is how do we make all our abilities and capacities work for everyone? And that is not the same as saying that distribution should be equal. In some areas, I even think that it's not even desirable for the distribution of everything to be equal. Now, I can go into great detail about these issues and the relation between personal responsibility and technology and institutions and all these things, but that's not the point. My point is that the reason for why I think distributional issues are at the heart of this, is that if there's something I think we see in many countries, it is the fact that a lot of people have started to question development per se. I think understandably so. And this is coming back to the points that Fredrik made. This is not to be understood as a pure sort of tax and redistribute issue. It's not just a monetary issue. It's a question of people broadly in society feeling that the development currently is not to my benefit. And that in itself is dangerous, I think, because I think that whether it's, part of that is monetary, but large parts of that are just feeling of being disregarded, and not being part of society. And of course there's individual responsibility in that, but I think there's also a greater responsibility for institutions more broadly, and for us all in whatever capacity we work to think about issues in those terms. Now, besides these issues, the distributional issues, there's of course a whole host of global issues, environmental in particular, and these things I think are also great challenges going forward. And to solve those, we need cooperation in some forms, for sure globally. Those we have to work out. And so from that point of view, the retraction that you see in many countries or many leaders turning inwards is, I think, a big challenge. Now, what to do about this? Well, I don't know. The thing I try to do is that I teach young people. And I've tried to, recently, I've been part of developing a new course, a new initiative at the Stockholm School of Economics called Global Challenges. And it's a course given to first-year students, which basically takes as its starting point, and this is now coming back to this not being an economist's question or a social scientist or no particular field. It takes as its starting point different global challenges, be it water quality or poverty or gender equality or whatever, and then it tries to make students think about, first of all, what is it that we know about this question? How do we know these things? And in that process, it's become very clear to me, and that's also coming back to what a lot of people here brought up already, that surprisingly large number of students these days have a very vague understanding of what truth is and the importance of truth. So for that reason, we've started to introduce little bits and pieces, which is very odd to me. This is not my field at all, but I simply cannot ignore the fact that we have to discuss how do we arrive at truth and these questions. And when introducing this course, then the next part of the course, after introducing all these challenges, we go on to talking about who should solve this, whose responsibility is it. And unsurprisingly to I guess everyone here, the answer goes all the way from the individual to global organizations. It's not just, the responsibility cannot be put on just one level. So I totally agree with what was said previously about individual responsibility, but that should not be misunderstood as saying that we should leave everyone to just solve these problems for themselves, because that's certainly not going to work. There's a zillion reasons for why just leaving individuals to work out these problems themselves will not give good solutions socially. Now, to finish off, what I start this course by is a quote from Karl Popper in his speech about scientific method, where he starts off by trying to define what scientific method is, and in those very first lines, he points out that there is no such thing as a subject. Subjects appear only because we need administrative organization of universities and ways of teaching, etc. The only thing that's true is that there are problems and there are people who are looking for solutions to those problems. So there are problems and people who want to solve them. Now we come at that from very different perspectives, but I think the school, and I'm honored to be here, for your 25th anniversary, really has taken on this. To me, at least, this is core idea of how you work, is to take people from very different areas of expertise and have them talk to each other with that one common sort of theme, which is we believe there is such a thing as truth. There are problems to be solved. We can solve them, so let's try to do that.
Спасибо большое.
Jesper, thank you very much. Andrey, the story that we have is that everybody seems to be seeking the truth. Kiselyov and Solovyov, the likes of Kiselyov and Solovyov, will not follow the truth, as it will certainly impede their work. Persons who are fed up with fake news that John, Sylvie and Pilar have spoken about, many people rest some hope on the internet, and there is some truth to be sought for and identified on the web. So there are people who are just surfing the seas of the information on their gadgets. Do you believe your internet or your web universe is going to help us to regain some universalism? Well, I think that a forecast is difficult to make, as the infrastructure of the internet itself, as we know it, the very infrastructure of it is under pressure, and this is something which is unfolding before our eyes. A couple of years ago, I was talking to an American official who was responsible for the White House's cybersecurity in the 1990s, and every year they were telling the administration that there would be a cyber attack to follow. And however, he said that his major problem was that nothing was happening. 20 years, every year they were saying that the threat is coming and nothing happened. The Russian officials pretty much had the same idea of the internet. When I came to the Russian State Duma for the first time for cybersecurity hearings in 1996, one of the speakers said that internet is a threat to the international security of Russia because it had been invented by the Americans. In 2016, while this was not a hacker attack as we understand it, and this was not a cyber attack as we know it, no critical junctures of the internet infrastructure were compromised. However, it became a signal for many people and organizations in trying to see what can be done about the internet. And here I have to distinguish two major points. People across the world have come to think that fortresses have to be built in the internet, in the web universe, by building up fortresses to protect the information security, yet again this term, in the national states. That, however, necessitates building walls and indeed introducing ruptures between national segments of the internet. This is the deliberations that we're seeing in Germany, in Russia, the so-called control or defense of the critical infrastructure, which in fact is nothing but control over the information flows. There's some words pronounced about this in the United States, in Britain, and this is becoming a significant problem because as a result we may well end up by seeing, instead of a global internet, nothing but a certain list of isolated internets with formidable state control and state influence. This idea of the digital sovereignty, which was and this digital sovereignty first proclaimed by countries like Russia and China and now carried forward by some others. So the question really is that the language of talking about the internet has itself changed. Today we're talking about the internet in the language of threats. What are the threats from the internet? What threat is the internet itself? What threats are to be found online? And this in turn is a dangerous tendency. And we're not just talking about authoritarian leaders with repressive regimes. Even very advanced and liberally minded politicians such as Thomas Hendrik Elis, the former president of Estonia, who is a great technological expert, is now asking a question, is that the verification, login and password were made up by people who did not think that internet would become global. So the principles of the internet are themselves under attack. But this is not just dangerous. Let us also remember that however naive we are, and however naive the founders of the internet could have been, but it is thanks to these principles that we got the internet as a fabric, because there is not much that can be built on the ideas of security. You could build a dungeon, you could build a fortress, you could build a jail or a prison, and indeed many fortresses along history have become dungeons or had dungeons, as every fortress had a dungeon in it. So, but not much else can be built through this paramount concept of security. Well, Sergei, I think, has been quite right, is that the opinions on this panel come from different topics or from different themes, and they may be somewhat disparate. And if an unprepared person listens to this, one may get an impression of a potpourri. However, I think that the thing that reminds me of that is that an anamnestic discharge note, whereas a person coming out from a hospital has a poor blood record, problems on the cardiac system, problems in the respiratory system, problems from the. So we have looked at the situation from the standpoint of the economists, from the standpoint of the journalists, from the standpoint of those who have met Andrey Zakharov coming back to Moscow from Nizhny Novgorod and Gorky at the time. We have heard the words of great anxiety from both journalists and the words of the internet. The presidents we are electing are not those whom we could be proud of. What we would like to do in the ambit of this school, because this medical examination may not be of great help, because a diagnosis without treatment is not always or mostly not particularly helpful. What is it to be done, however, after this diagnosis have been made in our next panel discussion? I would like us to see if in the framework of this open discussion we can see what are the ways to egress such a deadlock. But, however, I would like to ask every panelist, in what sphere, be it in the world or in Russia, what would you like to change? Where the treatment could be sought for and found? What ways of reform could you suggest? Because if we trust that our diagnosis is so poor that there is not much sense in treatment, then what has been the meaning of these 25 years of the school? And we would then have to give up. So we have to be asking this question. I know that Sylvie should soon leave. So what is the way out? Where should we look for the door?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to catch a plane, so I'll be leaving. But I want to say that I understand perfectly what Sergei Petrov says. Of course, Russia is very different, and it's a very different situation. And I mean, being a journalist in Russia and being a journalist in France is definitely not the same situation. So, but I believe in the power of example, and I think if we fail in what we are doing, then Russian situation will be even worse. So we all have to keep doing. Now, what we must do first is to identify our mistakes, because if we have come to this situation, I mean, I think one of us said that these people are not stupid. Of course, they are not, and people both in Western Europe, in the US, in Russia, have reasons to be angry. So I think the first step is to see why. What went wrong? What did we do wrong? Because there were things which were done wrong, both in terms of globalization, then democratization, so first thing. And then I think we have to keep working on civic society. We have to keep educating. We have to keep doing real journalism. We have to, I was talking earlier with John about media literacy. You are right, young people don't know what the truth is. It is true. They don't know, they have access to smartphones very early. They don't know what is real news, what is fake news. So this is something we never did because we thought truth was obvious. Now we know it's not obvious, so we have to go into high schools, into colleges and say, and educate people to reading to using the internet, to reading the news. These are, you have to keep doing what you are doing, Elena. It's very important. And, we now have the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers. We are exposing all this. I mean, it doesn't fall into a big hole. There's always something left of this. And, I think we just have to keep doing it, but adjusting to a new world and to a new reality and to the mistakes that have been made. Thank you very much. And so, Lena and the school, you have to keep going.
Спасибо. Thank you, Sylvie. And we will try to do that. And John, your addition to this recipe from your part.
It really is an addition, because I think, one thing you said of this, what we were, how we were talking as a kind of potpourri, very different and so on. We were, of course, different, and good that we were different, but one thing I think we all agreed on, that is, none of us said that truth is relative. All of us, either implicitly or explicitly, said that truth is, there is something called objective truth, and that journalism, academic inquiry, and other disciplines can get at that truth, or can attempt to get near that truth. I mean, truth is very difficult to get in its entirety, and journalism never does, but the important thing is the process of getting there. What else can you do, if you ask for what we should do in the future, is to carry on carrying on. The school carries on carrying on. Sylvie reminded us that you, in your day job, are in Transparency International, you're looking into corruption. What else can you do, and the people who publish Panama and Paradise Papers, but continue to display the enormous corruption in the world, which has probably got worse, who can tell, relatively, but certainly the sums are much greater. That there often is no comeback, that the people who have been exposed carry on carrying on being corrupt, that justice is, if it works at all, is very slow, is not, I think, a discouragement to carrying on. If you're in a profession which professes discovering the truth, as a lawyer is, the fact that there are crooked lawyers and crooked journalists and so on does not then invalidate the search. If we are looking for some kind of fabric which keeps societies together, especially democratic societies, where the truth is much more easy, at least possible to find, then we have to assume that there is something called objective truth and work according to it. I mean, Fredrik was saying that Marxism and Freudianism tended to destroy that, and as did academic fads, that truth was relative, that in postmodernism, truth simply didn't exist. It was only a question of who was in power and who could set the truth and back it up by power. That, I guess, still exists, but it doesn't seem to have had huge effect on the truth-finding institutions, of which journalism is or should be one. So carrying on seems to me to be, if you have got that as the core of much of what you do, failing often as you do, then what else is there? I was passionate about Trump and and like Sylvie, I don't think that Western journalists have a harder time than Russian ones. I know they don't. What I wanted to get, and indeed I said, that Russian journalists, authoritarian journalists, are often prevented from knowing the truth. They can't know the truth because they are not able to. They're forbidden from doing so, and that's not true in democratic countries. But the threat of Trump is that you have someone with enormous power and status putting into the water of democratic journalism, to say so, that it is fake. And that's a new kind of threat, a different kind of threat from authoritarian journalism, new, dangerous, because it encourages authoritarian journalism. However, one has to say that the American journalists in the newspapers and in broadcast, most of them, not all, are combating it. And combating it so far rather successfully. There's a fight going on. The truth has to occasionally, or rather, truth has often to fight for its right to exist and to proclaim that it is the truth. And the American journalists are in that. Unusually, actually, for them, because they haven't had to do it at that level. But they are doing it. They're doing it successfully, and they must continue to do it.
Fredrik, you said we need to somehow restore individual responsibility in the people to progress forward. How? Where to get the tool to do that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think we need to be excessively dystopian about things. I mean, my point is basically that what you find is behind the political revolts, whether it's Trump, whether it's Brexit, I think sort of the only significant political revolt, I'm not sure we can call it a revolt though, that didn't fit this pattern is basically the support for Front National in France. But in all other political revolts, it's old people that are revolting. It's not young people that are revolting. It's all people, and when you look sort of at the demographics of the political revolt, sort of the point that really stands out in terms of sort of it's just very difficult to explain is why has the baby boomer generation started to revolt? Why do they want to make revolt now? I mean, this is a generation that sort of grew up with the sexual revolution, the religious revolution, the musical revolution, the academic revolutions. I mean, if you live in America, I mean, you don't have to be sort of a supporter of the Black Panther in the 1960s at Berkeley in order to have gone through an enormous rebellious change in your life, and now you want to do it again. When we look at young people, it's actually different. I mean, I'm actually pretty optimistic in the sense that young people, they have a much better ability to understand what is true, what is false on the internet. It's my parents' generation that think that everything is on the internet is true, because I've read it there, so it must be true, because they were grown up sort of believing that everything that was in the newspaper was true. I think the ability to detect bullshit and figure things out for yourself is actually much stronger among young people than it is about in old generations. Young people in America right now, they don't live in a society where their generation, the stuff they're reading is that political evangelism that topped the bestseller list of New York Times and other types of bestseller lists in America for a long, long time. And all these books, what they were spurning out was sort of a fantasy about individuals, a fantasy about society. Which was, of course, completely untrue. But they don't read that, and they're not very much part of that type of change. So, but the point is sort of, as everyone has said, I mean, you can take an enormous amount of personal responsibility by sort of just go on and do good things, do right things, and the school has done it and should continue to do it. Whether you're a journalist, an academic, or just sort of a private citizen who wants to be sort of a good parent or a good father, you can do an enormous amount of positive change in society.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Sergei. Andrey, Ira, what do you do? Where is the way out in your sphere, and what would be the right way? What would be the right sort of prescription to to help those who are putting a brake on our free development online? Where is the right way out if we can continue looking it up on your map after lunch? Of course, we must look at this crisis as a great opportunity, but this is the way we should view it. But look, for Russian journalists, it's a great opportunity. Now everybody is thinking about Russia. Hence the growing opportunity for Russian investigative journalism to work together with their colleagues in other countries. Everybody cares about Russia. We have got the global world, we live in this global world. Therefore, possibilities of cooperation between journalists also are greater. All the most recent scandals from Panama Papers, from Paradise Papers, they all just result of cooperation from journalists from many new countries. It's thanks to new technologies. As to internet, the governments and corporations would want us to forget how this works. They would want us to think that somewhere they've got this sort of wires very much like, I don't know, like water pipelines, and it is to be professionals who have to take care of this water and sewage. But thanks to this scandal, yes, very many bad things happened, but a good thing followed too. You know, common people got very much interested how this works, and this opens great opportunity for us too, not to get to understand how this works, but also to influence the way it works. I hate this phrase, which Russian officials like so much. Leave it to us. We are professionals. We can take care of that. Leave it. Let the business of governance be run by the government. And that was the message by Putin beginning with the year 2000. Any expertise that the experts come up with, journalists, who cares for that? We get to manage that. That was encapsulated system. It now has been destroyed. Now everybody cares what is really going on. This is an opportunity. well, let's go online, because what Sergei Petrov said, you don't need any local prescriptions that don't work. But what works is global things. Once they've adopted censorship, Russian government things have been blocked. Well, they couldn't shut down access to any source of information online because everybody works Tor, downloaded VPNs. Okay, they banned VPNs now, the law, or rather made VPN to block the forbidden information. Okay, no question, global corporations are now developing such media to bypass censorship, which will be hiding the traffic of VPN in the normal traffic. You won't be able to find the way that a person is using or a company has been using VPN, and it's great because since here, in a sense of media freedom and internet freedom, Russia, they've lost it, and locally nothing can be changed, but global things work, they work. Nobody can do anything about this. Well, this helps to develop all the big good things. Now we have the investigation by Navalny. This became possible only because of YouTube. You can't block it, no matter how hard you try. Thousands of people would repost it, and it will continue to exist. Journalist teams, investigative journalists, we've seen decline in investigative journalism some 4 to 5 years ago. There was nothing you could quote, with the exception of some individual pieces. Now whole teams work. Now they place it on Facebook, and that's it. How can you block Facebook? But people again will open VPNs. You can block VPNs, then they will start using VPNs that cannot be blocked because you wouldn't realize they're VPNs. So this is where things work. But here the struggle indeed should be global. You must maintain this global structure of internet and try to use the current situation of pressure that is placed on global internet corporations, because they also own great power in trying to understand how they use their algorithms. Can these algorithms be accountable not to government and non-government power but to the society? And how to create these public entities and structures? Who would be able to question them, demand that they should answer? Because we can't, ask business about business, but amend the legislation in such a way that they should be accountable. Like Facebook would say, why a small site is not seen, how to rank it, no matter. But RT is seen everywhere. It's a good situation. Thank you. Thank you, Ira. Pilar, I've known you, I know you care a lot about the place of individual journalism in today's world. How can you maintain your independence and the possibility to ask a question, and to speak the truth? What would you say? Well, actually, this is a question of personal responsibility, again, what was just said. But here we see 2 points which demanded greater discussion here. Can any person be a journalist or not? Is journalism a profession which, I guess exactly, that's what you point, that requires certain skills or not? I stand for this being a profession, yes, with certain standards that have to be kept up in certain background, but I've made a list of questions that could be done. Of course, it could be questionable. You just mentioned in part some things. The first of all, cooperation with other journalists, global front, for sure. Cooperation between journalists living in different countries, investigative journalism, journalistic investigations, and I think at the level of personal and individuality, this is that people who take part in these investigations should be prepared so that their property and their financial matters, we journalists, whatever we have to be available, this information openly, because we need to minimize this, what we know, black. We must limit the space for corruption and for under-the-board payments. We want the politicians to be accountable, but we also have to be accountable too. And then, my friends, I make the choice, therefore, we need to create clubs where personal reputation and goodwill with certain criteria that need to be met. In this club, not everybody can become a member, and we need to generally accepted criteria for people to be admitted to these clubs. I choose my own friends, and if they don't live up to these criteria, they should be, we need a blacklist. And we must have members of elite club, and this requires certain criteria on the both sides. Then, what else? Yes, another point. What is the role of the school? I think this is much needed. You must create the space for dialogue within the school, for journalists too, and for education. To disseminate the skills in the education system or near the education system, to create this notion of journalists as search for truth, as serving other people. Well, somebody else can do it, but journalism doesn't boil down to PR. This is the first limitation. Secondly, it seems to me, if you think about the space where we are now at, in my case, it's a post-Soviet space. The journalists should also organize a dialogue, as I think. And we're very short. We don't have enough of this dialogue in terms of places where the war is on, because in the post-Soviet space, there's a war going on in Donetsk. We must organize a dialogue between the Russians and Ukrainians, between the people who live in this space. There are 2 million people who live there. This is pro-Russian territory and the remaining space, and other spaces that were, let me put it this way, were not harmonically integrated into modern world. I don't want to name these spaces like a black hole. I don't want to see them as a hand of the Kremlin, but it seems to me we have major shortage, just like. This is my strong point, this is my pet subject, that the school should incorporate and integrate people from Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Nagorno Karabakh, Transnistria. Something is said off the line. Not quite so. What I mean, people who live there. Yes, it's good, even the better that that is the case. And this is the last point I wish to make, and as I'm wrapping up on a thought that I shared, that Ina told me, this is something we need to do, but this goes beyond. We need to do TV programs, shows from we must broadcast it from your kitchen. We must use your kitchen to create special programs for journalists. Thank you, Pilar.
Beyond teaching, beyond helping students only in the Stockholm school to find the truth, what can we do? Where is the domain of possible answers?
Well, I think everyone basically pointed to international corporations and contacts with people. I mean, that's the way you you understand other perspectives, and I think that in any area that's really crucial. I also think that, I somewhat, surprisingly perhaps, I share both John's and Fredrik's perspective on the question about truth and the insistence on that there is such a thing as truth. I think that is really important. I agree that young people are better equipped at some dimensions of getting at this when it comes to understanding what on the internet could be fake or exaggerated. But I think and this is a difficult balance, because I think that there is a lot, at least my experience from teaching in Sweden but also in the UK and in the US. I think there's been a shift, which is partly a very positive shift in terms of questioning authority and questioning scientists, but to a degree where it has, for some, been misunderstood as, anyone's truth is as good as anyone else's truth, and for at least some, this has gone sort of too far. And the question is, how do we strike that balance of accepting and understanding that, you know, there is such a thing as somebody who's better informed, or, you know, somebody who actually knows more than you do about something, and that you can approach that with some kind of, you know, understanding of where does that knowledge come from, and on what basis is this person actually more qualified than you are to make a statement about something. But at the same time, not fall back, which is something I totally don't want, not falling back into an authoritarian version of truth where, you know, I hold this degree and therefore I know better. That's not the point. That's not what constitutes knowing something. But this, I think, is, you know, this is sort of from personal point of view something I struggle with. How do you convey this message that, you know, people don't hold the truth because of their position or because of their title, but because of something else. But that something else, you know, makes some people more qualified than others to make statements about the world and what we observe. I think finding that balance is very important.
Thank you, Jesper. Sergei.
Можно?
Sergei, can I distract you for a second and ask you this question? Just closer to this evening, somebody, and many by the end of this week, will get back home. And not only to Moscow. And when they get back to Moscow, elsewhere in Russia, trapped between this tiny space between this population, like 57%, who would in some way, somebody claim it is as high as 86%, others 60%, and the government, who are delighted about this sort of unity with this percentage, and they feel fine. And there's people who belong to their school, and not only from their school, as they get back there, they want to do something, because the alternative is sit and wait while something flies, floats by, and you don't know how long you have to wait. So getting back into this tiny slit between the government and the society. What do you need to do instead of sitting idly waiting for something to do? What I want to say, give the last rites? No, certainly not. But let me start. Look at our history. Look back at our history. Those people from any century. I remember the time Stolypin tried to carry out the change, but carrying out reform. If you don't know such factors as in the Duma, the deputies, the gendarmes searched their flat, but they could not do it. And they had hearings. Immediately Duma queried, and he gets up and says, I don't care about your laws. If the empire is in jeopardy, I'm ready to violate any law or any bylaw. But it didn't save, it didn't save. Today, some activities, may I tell you that in the diaries of Milutin, 40 years ago, Dmitry Milutin, one of the brothers of this, who wrote, they keep trying to attempt on the life of the Tsar, and they make on us, but they're doing the right thing, because we are violating every law. Whatever we gave, the judicial reform, Zemskaya reform, we gave it all to the police who are handling that. And what do? There is nothing I could do. There is not anybody around me who even understand what scale of change Russia needs. It has always been the case in Russian history. Now, no policing measures would ever produce this sort of protection. You need to protect it, you need to discuss it to who is in touch with who, the far the better. There's only one track forward. This is an ability to use the instruments and the tools, an ability, first of all, to tell them, like everybody, politics is dirty business. No, it's not right. It's a highly moral thing, like business. It's not just about selling and buying. It's also a highly moral matter. All large companies that have multi-billion turnover have their own standards of moral. Otherwise, you will not be able, unless it is owned by the state. But it doesn't work long. Together with the state, they fail at a certain time. Second thing, we need to explain that all the change, well, I suppose they were Kennedy's words, that all the peaceful, whoever stands in the way of peaceful change makes violence inevitable. It is not to blame for those who want fair play, fair elections, and abiding by the law. It is those people who are to blame, just like you want to destabilize. How come we won't allow? In point of fact, there's a grunting. This is their work they need to do. They won't do anything. They won't get anything, but they will continue to blame, and they will really jeopardize many people. How this needs to be done? Everybody decides upon the level of risk one can accept. We cannot recommend anybody should sacrifice their life. It's important to resist. It's as much as you can. Everybody can decide at one's own, but never allow the society to go away into this sort of swamp. Never allow this law enforcement to do what they have been doing. What they think, of course you don't need to conflict with them, but make it public, in a public space, saying that this doesn't work this way. There's clubs, elitist clubs, which I also been dreaming to have in this country some 25 years ago as we starting my business, that we will shut down the doors to all the ministers. Now they've shut the doors on us, and they're sitting behind them and don't allow us at all. And there is nothing we can do about this. A huge chunk of population is not much caring about these moral syndromes. It doesn't seem to work. So the only way is to marginalize, to emigrate, to leave. Let's do what we can. Anybody can do it, but just don't fall asleep. Well, and actually I think this is what we're going to discuss after lunch. How the sum of individual personal resistance, how to convert it into collective intellectual, well thought of, in secure and safe. At that nobody can guarantee that. But before that, I want to ask you a question. Well, let us thank our distinguished panelists.